Thank you for tuning into the Hearth of Hellenism podcast. It's me again, Angelo, your host. In today's interview, I am talking with Dr. Robin Douglas. He is an independent scholar and writer on the history of religion. He has a PhD from Cambridge University, where he previously completed his master's and bachelor's degrees in classics with a specialization in ancient history. And we're talking about a new book that he co-authored with Francis Young. It's called Paganism Persisting, A History of European Paganism Since Antiquity. I want to read from the back cover of the book. Paganism in Europe was not defeated by Christianity. It never went away. From the 4th century to the 20th century, against the backdrop of a largely Christian culture, people repeatedly attempted to revive various kinds of pre-Christian religion, beliefs and practices that we have come to label as paganism. But ancient paganism did not survive the Middle Ages in its original form. This book tells the story of the persistence of elements of paganism and the pagan idea through Europe's pagan revivals, from Byzantine Greece to medieval Eastern Europe and Renaissance Florence, from the 18th century Norwich to revolutionary Paris and Edwardian England. While some of these revivals are well known and others are almost entirely forgotten, they reveal the rich diversity of interpretations of paganism and how those interpretations have been contributed by the surrounding culture. Revived paganisms range from the austerely rational to the earnestly romantic, from the mystical and occult to the stridently nationalistic. Paganism Persisting uncovers European paganism's long afterlife, up to and including the emergence of modern paganism as a mass movement in the 20th century. The authors are both historians of religion, specializing, respectively, in the intellectual history of the idea of paganism and in the development of popular religion and folklore. This volume has much to offer to anyone interested in European cultural history, the history of ideas, and religious studies. So I'm really excited to have Robin on the podcast today to talk about this idea of paganism persisting and his persistence model for understanding and contextualizing the many revivals of paganism across the centuries. And this is interesting for me because I am part of a current revival and movement within the Greek community, trying to revive ancient Greek practices. And this is a movement that, roots itself and looks back towards its last revival attempt with Plethon in the 15th century as our last predecessor in this sort of project. And my question within this context of this revival is how much of what is being done today and who claims to have family traditions or has mystery initiations or whatever it is. There are people out there who make many claims to have lineages. And my question is, well, do these people go back to Plethon in any way? I think some do. I can't prove that. This is a discussion for another time. But then there's other people who make claims that they maybe go back further than Plethon, or that they have specifically mystery teachings, esoteric teachings that are part of a mystery tradition that goes back to antiquity or is an authentic expression of a mystery tradition, and that I don't believe. So the mysteries unfortunately did die out in antiquity, and we don't have them. So anyone out there saying that they do have them, I would be skeptical. So but yeah, so that topic of the survival of paganism, what has come down to us across the centuries, is something I am still open to exploring. Our last reference before Plethon was the 9th century in the Peloponnese in Greece, in a region called Mani, where there was the last holdout of pagans where they were unbaptized. So that's our last account. And then you have to just look at the Byzantine Empire itself and its activities. What kind of resurgences did they have? But what I want to talk, this could go into an entire another podcast. But right now, I will say that when it comes to the subject of how, if polytheism survived Christianity in any way, how would we know? How would we look for it? Because a classicist would not be a good person, I think, to do the job, because a classicist is trained in the very, ancient and public display of the religion, because back then the religion was supported by the polis. It was civic. There was this civic institutional sort of support for festivals and things like that. And one of the things that contributed to the downfall of this and the rise of Christianity is that the money disappeared to support temples and to support public festivals. You at that point you really relied on individuals within the cities and within these communities who had the resources to donate their money to put things on, to put festivals on. And as those resources declined and people didn't have the means to pay for to sponsor, basically sponsorship and patronizing these festivals, things really do go quiet. And if you want to look for and try to find paganism, you can't do it on the civic level. So what level would it be on? It would have to, logically, I think it would have to be in families, in little towns, in the mountains and outside of the cities. And this is a history that you're really not going to be able to reconstruct, because the texts aren't there, because historians largely rely on textual evidence. And so it's a very difficult subject, and that's why many historians will just say it all died out. But I'm more optimistic that there's got to be something of some sort that evolved out of it all. And it's interesting then to ask the question that when Plethon, by the 15th century, when Plethon was doing his project in the Peloponnese of trying to revive the ancient religion as the state religion for the empire, and to establish his political reforms, was there anyone outside and independent of Plethon that contributed to him anything that was pre-existing in that region? That's a question that I have that I don't have the means to answer, unfortunately. And then the question is, after Plethon, what happened after Plethon? Where did the students go? Did any of those students, kept his project and his religion alive? Did they adopt it and change it and reworked it, and things evolved independently after that, after Plethon? These are questions I can't answer. I don't have the resources, the materials to examine. At this point, you have to look at families and lineages and where did these people go. For example, with Plethon, I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but Plethon had students. One of the students was Laonikos Halkokondylis. He was part of a prominent Athenian family the family goes back to the 11th century in Athens, a noble family in Athens. So they have a long history there. He has marriage ties to Florentine nobility in Florence, and so it's like they have those connections. I think Laonikos had a nephew, or someone in his family, like a nephew or something, that was later a teacher in Pavia. And so, like, it's interesting. So you have these people, they had lives in the Renaissance, and they did things, and it's like, well, how far did maybe their interests in the classical, in the ancient Greek, how far did it go? And again, these are things that you're not going to know, because they're not going to just come out there and say, hey, I worship Zeus so explicitly. these things would be secretive. Again, this is all very speculative. I know it's all speculation, but it's interesting because I am part of a revival and I want to know and figure out how far back does this revival go and what has contributed to this revival that I do not know about. These are questions I have. Maybe one day I'll figure it out. But for now, we have this persistence model that we're going to talk about from Robin. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation.
All right, Robin, thank you so much for being here today to talk about the new book that you co authored with Francis Young, Paganism Persisting, A History of European Paganism Since Antiquity.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so tell me about what the book is about when persisting. What is paganism persisting?
Right, yes. Um, it's an attempt to go beyond the two main models of looking at post-classical paganism that have prevailed in the past 100 or 200 years. Um, the first of those models was the idea that ancient paganism had survived linearly into Christian times. And that involved a rather naive belief, or a belief that may seem naive today, that society hadn't really been Christianized, that the Christian faith was just a veneer on the top of a deep reservoir of paganism. And this idea became very popular in Victorian times and also for a considerable part of the 20th century.
Hmm.
And it was bound up with various prejudices. In this country, for example, it was bound up with a certain view which middle class and wealthier people had of people who lived in the countryside. There was the idea that if you took a train outside London, then within an hour's journey of your home, you could find peasants who were still performing rites and practicing customs which dated back in unbroken succession to pagan times. They might claim to be Christians and they might go to church, but in substance they were still pagan. And you had similar ideas elsewhere. In Germany, you had Wilhelm Manhart, for example, who was influential in promoting that sort of idea. Those ideas about pagan survival have been discredited essentially since roughly the 1970s. The most famous such idea, I should say, was Margaret Murray's theory, which was that witchcraft,
Yeah.
the phenomenon known as witchcraft in early modern Christian Europe, was a direct survival of an ancient pagan fertility cult. Um, that was a widely believed and influential view. And Gerald Gardner, of course, the founder of Wicca, then came along and said, well, not only did paganism survive into the early modern period, it's still around today. It was still around in 1950s England, and he claimed to have met some of the surviving witches, and he said that um, uh, Wicca was the religion that they practiced. But anyway, those ideas have been essentially discredited um, since the 70s. And since then, uh, an alternative idea has become popular, which is that modern, revived, contemporary expressions of paganism are essentially new. They're essentially like Scientology. They are products of the modern age.
Yeah.
They have little or no connection with actual pre Christian paganism. And some people then go further and say, well, that means that they're illegitimate because a religion, in the view of these people, has to have history and tradition behind it to be legitimate. And because contemporary paganism apparently lacks those things, it is illegitimate. It can be dismissed and it has no value.
Yeah, I don't like
Now,
that.
that idea is a fallacy in
Yeah.
itself. Um,
Yeah.
but I think the idea that revived paganism is a modern construct it's partially true, but it's misleading. And this is where the idea of persistence comes in. Ever since Christianity came along, um, elements of the pre-Christian past have been preserved in European and American culture. And they've been preserved in the form of the texts that people study in school. Um, that would, of course, would be for people who were wealthy enough to be literate and to go to school, but also they were preserved in the form of things like public monuments, statues, visual imagery, and so forth. Um, and so there's always been this body of paganism which has been um, persistent within Christian culture throughout the centuries. And it's always been there. It's always been available for people to come to it and to revive it as a fully fledged religious system, a system of belief and practice. Because there's not that much of a distance between reading about and studying pagan philosophy or pagan mythology and believing in those things.
Yeah.
There's never been that much of a distance between having a statue of Apollo or Minerva and worshipping those gods. And there's a tradition going back some centuries of Christians being quite worried about this and saying, well, there's a temptation here for people to fall into idolatry and to fall away from the true faith. So it was seen as being a problem by Christians. And that danger and that potential was always there. And then from the 18th century onwards, as the Christian monopoly of religion is broken in the Western world, you start to have an increasing number of people reviving the old ways and the old ideas, the old beliefs and the old images. This has gone on throughout history, but particularly in the last 300 years, this has been a growing phenomenon in Western culture. And yes, persistence is the term that we've used in the book to describe the way in which these pagan ideas have stayed around, have hung around in Western culture, waiting to be revived. And that's an alternative to seeing paganism as something that literally, linearly survived on the one hand, and as revived paganism as being an inauthentic new modern thing on the other.
Now, so where does this all begin? Like the history of this revival? Where do we first see the first attempt at revival?
Oh well, no sooner had Christianity come to a dominant position than the first attempt at pagan revival came along. As I say, pagan revivalism has been particularly strong in the modern age since the 1700s, but it goes back a lot further than that.
Hmm.
And in the fourth century, you have the Emperor Julian, who can be seen as the first pagan revivalist, if
Every
we have to
pagan's
give that
favorite
title.
emperor.
He was, I'm sorry,
Every pagan's favorite emperor.
indeed, yes, yes. I think actually Sasha Chato even made an icon of him, which Chas Clifton has blogged about,
Hmm.
a sort of icon in
Yeah.
the style of a saint.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's an iconic figure, Julian, and all sorts of people have looked back on him as a kind of hero. That would include modern polytheists and
I
pagans. It
have
would
very
also
mixed
include
feelings about him.
right, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, he was an ambiguous character. Yeah, um, not necessarily a hero, or at least not completely. Um, yeah, I mean, he's been admired by people coming from a secular point of view. I mean, Voltaire, for example, the great Enlightenment philosopher,
Mhm.
liked him essentially because he was the enemy of Voltaire's enemy. It was an enemy of my enemy thing.
Yes.
He liked him because he was against Christianity.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, Julian came to the imperial throne after some decades of Christian emperors. That, of course, started with the Emperor Constantine and his conversion to Christianity. And then Constantine's family reigned for a period of decades. And then Julian emerged and uh, I won't go through the process, but he came to be the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. There were several steps that he went through, but from 361 to 363, he reigned as as the sole Roman emperor. And his project was to restore the pagan past, not only the pagan religion, but also Hellenismos more generally,
Yeah.
the lost culture that he saw as being displaced and downgraded by Christianity. And that would have included classical literature and so
Yes.
forth as well.
Yeah, that's a
One thing he
particular term, Hellenism, Hellenismos. Like when I was reading your book, I didn't see it pop up, so I was looking for Hellenism itself to appear, and it doesn't. And It's interesting because that's a term that is often linked with Julian. When I was getting more deep into this, the modern pagan movement, there was this misnomer floating around all the time that Julian coined the term Hellenism, Hellenismos, and it meant religion. It was a religious label, but it isn't. It goes back to the Hellenistic period with a term to denote proper Greek grammar. And so I always been trying to figure out where has this, why do people make this incorrect sort of representation that Julian coined a religion? And that's been something I've been trying to figure out with modern pagans.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. I think it comes of our modern post-Enlightenment view that religion is a separate part of life.
Yeah,
And it then becomes easy to say, well, what Julian was doing was restoring the pagan religion, whereas in
yeah,
fact, Julian, as a pre-modern person who
yeah,
didn't make the distinction between religion and the rest of culture, was trying
yeah.
to restore the whole of the lost culture that was being
Exactly.
displaced by the
He was
Christians.
he was trying to take the religion and attach it to the things that Hellenism represented, the culture, the Paideia, philosophy, everything of culture, of language. He was trying to mm, tie it to religion that way to kind of force the Christians out. That's kind of where I've concluded at this point.
Yeah, and it's expressed in things like, for example, he prohibited Christians from teaching classical texts and
Exactly.
classical literature. And that doesn't really make sense if all he was doing was performing a religious reform, but it does make sense if he was performing a broader cultural
Yeah.
reform.
Yeah. Exactly. So, his revival, how could we characterize it? Is it truly something that would be recognized as like traditional religion? Is it unique to himself? What is about himself and what he was doing as a revival?
Well, like all revivals, it had an element of the new as well as the old.
Hmm.
Um, as one Greek philosopher said, I think it was Heraclitus, you can't step into the same river twice. And if you try to restore something, you're always going to incorporate elements of the new as well as the old. So what Julian was doing was, in one sense, turning the clock back, getting the old temples operating again, restoring the sacrifices which had ceased to be performed. But he was also promoting a new vision of what was essentially a pagan church.
Yeah.
He saw himself as being a pagan pope, um, and he had the hierarchy of clerics under him, who he wrote letters to in the same way that popes send out encyclicals. Excuse me. And the philosophical underpinnings of this were drawn from the Neoplatonic tradition. And Neoplatonism and Platonism were established forms of philosophy. They didn't start with Julian. He was drawing on quite a long tradition there. But nevertheless, he was foregrounding and promoting and emphasizing Neoplatonist ideas in a way that hadn't really been the case in earlier iterations of paganism. And his project was new in other ways. For example, he thought that the Christian church had got the right idea about charity towards the poor, and he thought that Christians had outshone pagans in that regard. So he said, "Well, we've got to get our act together, and we'd better develop our own ethic of charity." So there were various ways in which his project was new as well as being traditionalist.
Hmm. Okay. And ultimately, he obviously didn't succeed. And so, from after Julian, when do we see revival again in that part of the empire?
Well, revival that one can always trace one can play the game of trying to pinpoint when indigenous, as it were, paganism died out, and there are
Yes.
several candidates for that.
Hmm.
But as for revival, um, yeah, we're looking at the Byzantine Empire, uh,
But
which
let's
was the
backtrack. What are those demarcations of when it ended?
yes, the most famous candidate is probably Haran, the town of Haran in Mesopotamia. And it's believed that exiled Greek pagans and philosophers settled there, and they then combined with
Mhm.
the native population, and they kept the flame of paganism burning until the Islamic conquests.
Mm.
So that's probably the most famous candidate. And what one can look for other candidates. I believe there's a report that in the ninth century there was a community of people in the Peloponnese who
Yeah.
were still pagans and had to be baptized. You never quite know what to make of reports like that,
Yeah.
but yeah, you can identify little cases like that.
Yes.
But as for revival, we're looking to the intellectual class of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, of course, was the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East when it had collapsed in the West or declined in the West. And um, the Byzantines, because they'd preserved much of ancient Greek culture, they had this persistent um, uh, what's the metaphor? Like a piece of radioactive rock. They had this thing
Yeah.
which was always it always had the potential of becoming live again,
Yeah.
and of being revived.
Yeah, they're always
Um,
still connected. They didn't lose that connection because of they had the text. The transmission of the ancient texts came down to us
yeah,
through Constantinople. So they're always in touch with it. So that temptation to kind of go that, as we said before, that one step further to believing or practicing or incorporating those ideas or just simply taking it seriously was always present to some degree.
yeah, indeed, and particularly as regards the Platonist school of philosophy,
Hmm.
um, that was always there, and that could always be reactivated. Um, I suppose that's the metaphor rather than a radioactive rock. It was like a machine where there's always a button there that you can
Yeah.
press, and people did press that button at various times.
What happened when they
Uh,
pressed? Well, who pressed the buttons and what happened to those people?
well, there were several waves in the Greek Middle Ages. There were several waves of revivals. The most famous one was at the end of the Middle Ages with Plato, um, the 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 great and unorthodox philosopher.
Mhm.
Before that, there had been in the 11th century, for example, Magorpselos, who was interested in ancient paganism and magic and theurgic ritual
Mhm.
and that sort of thing. And there'd also been a previous revival before him. So there were these successive waves of people rediscovering Platonic paganism and reviving it. Um, and yeah, the best known and the most influential of these waves came with Platon, who lived in the 14th and 15th centuries. He had quite a long life, and he was influential not only through his own work, but also because he had followers and disciples and admirers
Mhm.
who continued his ideas, and also who went to Italy and influenced developments there.
And so with Plethon, what was like with Julian? We talked about the old and the new. Is that a similar case with Plethon? What could we see in his work that is recognizably as like something traditional or something old? But what is the elements that are new and his own?
Yeah, he's been compared to an Enlightenment thinker.
Okay.
He had quite a rationalistic take on things.
Hmm.
He spoke the language of paganism. He referred to Zeus and the ancient gods. He was explicitly pagan in that way, but he also had a rationalistic bent. Um, and he didn't, for example, much like magic and mysticism and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, he wanted a purified, or what he would have seen as a purified version of paganism, which left that sort of thing behind. And yeah, he wrote a whole treatise called The Laws, presumably based on the laws of Plato.
Hmm.
And that doesn't survive in its entirety, but fragments or parts of it do. And we can see from that that there's a debate about how serious he was with this, whether he really wanted to create a new pagan society.
Hmm.
Um, and we can't be sure about that, but maybe he did. And if he had created that society, it would look very modern in many ways. It would be quite a rational form of religion, something that the philosophers of the Enlightenment would have recognized. Someone like Voltaire, for example, might have been simpatico with it. And he also uh, he he was keen on ideas that we would associate with modernity, nationalism, socialism. So if he'd been able to create his ideal society, it would have looked quite modern
Yeah,
and not kind of 15th century.
yeah. He's for in Greek historiography, he's seen as like a proto Greek nationalist for foreshadowing the Greek modern nation state. So that's interesting. There was one historian, I think it's Woodhouse. He described him as the last Hellene and the first Greek in that regard.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
he's an
indeed.
interesting figure, yeah. And then, so Plethon has, then we have Plethon going to Italy, and he has contacts in Italy and people he influences there. So, um, pagan revival in the West now is when does that start? Does it start before the Renaissance?
Well, it really comes into its own in the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, which is basically the Renaissance period, and Italy is the center of this. Um, and the people who lived in what is today Italy, we can't speak of Italy then because it's an anachronism,
Yeah.
but the people who were culturally Italian um, came to be absolutely obsessed with ancient Rome and the ancient Roman inheritance. And again, it was a bit like Hellenismos. It wasn't just the religion. They identified with the literature and the culture
Yeah.
and the art as well as the religion. And they saw themselves as being um, essentially ancient Romans born again. And while that wasn't confined to religion, religion had to form part of that. And even though they were Christians, they played with pagan ideas and flirted very heavily with paganism. And some of them may have crossed the line into outright embracing paganism. And even when they didn't cross that line, you have people like Marsilio Ficino, or Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who are fusing pagan and Christian ideas, making a kind of hybrid. And there were scholars who tried to identify resemblances between Christianity and ancient paganism. So yeah, they are in a similar way to the Emperor Julian, that they're trying to revive a whole lost culture and identify with a whole ancient society, and to mobilize that as a way of creating an identity for themselves in the present and for the future.
Hmm. And I feel like that's what we're still doing today. Like not we're going from the Renaissance now, skipping to like modern times. There's probably plenty we could speak of in between. Before we go, I guess more modern. Where could we jump to between the Renaissance and our current times when we talk revivals? Because now we're probably more definitely in Western part of Europe.
Yeah, I think probably the 18th century is when this stuff starts to gather momentum.
Okay, and what's going on in the 18th century?
Oh, well, there's a number of developments. At this point, Christianity has lost its monopoly
Mm-hmm.
on the religious marketplace, to use that metaphor,
Yeah.
for a number of reasons. You have the rise of Enlightenment philosophy, the rise of science. You've had endemic religious war, which has discredited Christianity in many people's eyes. And in the 18th century, certainly in Britain, you start to have the legal restrictions scaled back. And so the Christian churches are no longer protected necessarily by official persecution. And so you have entrepreneurs springing up. One example would be Thomas Taylor,
Mm-hmm.
whose books you have there, who, of course, revived and mobilized Platonist philosophy in service of a pagan project. And there were other figures like that. There was another English guy called John Frensham, for example. Some of the German romantics were sympathetic to paganism and pagan ideas. And you have Hölderlin, Schiller, Goethe, um, and uh, I mentioned Voltaire as well. In France, you have figures like Voltaire, who Voltaire was not a pagan, but he admired pagan cultures. He admired the Emperor Julian. He admired Chinese culture and Confucius,
Mm-hmm.
who would have been regarded as pagan by Christians. So even people like that, people like Voltaire, who weren't pagans themselves, could admire and be influenced by pagan civilizations. Um, and this culminates in a very important development towards the end of the 18th century, and that's the coming of the Romantic movement.
Okay, yes.
And that's when you really find the first um, instances of modern paganism appearing, and it's in the work of literary writers and poets. And in this country, it would be Shelley, for example, and Keats and their circle of people, Thomas Love Peacock, Leigh Hunt, Thomas Jefferson Hogg. Uh, this is the early 19th century by now. And paganism appeals to these people because we've had the Enlightenment.
Hmm.
So we've had this attack on Christianity from a rationalist, um, secular, in some cases atheistic point of view. But there are people like Shelley and Keats and their circle, who see the limitations and deficiencies in Christianity, who think it's authoritarian and excessively strict, but who also think that Enlightenment rationalism is too dry.
Hmm.
There's nothing spiritual there. There's nothing there for the
Disenchantment
soul.
of the world, right?
Exactly, yeah,
So
exactly.
they're trying to re-enchant the world.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and paganism becomes a third way. There was the two-party system, Christianity and Enlightenment secularism. Paganism is a third way, and it's a third party. It's only a small movement, but it's significant. And if you've got people like Shelley, nationally and internationally known figures on board, and there were equivalent people in other countries. French poets, for example, were part of this movement too. Um, Even though it's only a small number of people, these are people who are famous, who are influential, who are publishing stuff, who are read by other wealthy and powerful people, um, and you can draw a straight line from them to the pagans of today, the people who you would um, you know meet in a coven or in pagan spaces online.
Gotcha. And now that brings us to the modern times of pagans, and there is I'm part of, sort of this stuff too myself with Greek revival. And so this topic is interest to me because I'm part of a revival movement in my own way. And when do we see in Europe, I guess, very organized revival? Because it seems like historically it's individuals, certain people or little groups. But when do we, I think it's more of a modern thing to see more organizational attempts. Is that accurate,
Mhm.
do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. Basically, the later part of the 19th century. Um, in this country, in Britain, you have the best example is the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which
Yeah.
is founded in 1888, which is semi-pagan.
Yeah.
It blends paganism and Christianity. Osiris is blended with Jesus Christ and so forth.
Hmm.
So yeah, you that's one example. Um, I think I'm right in saying the first legal entity, the first pagan legal entity to be incorporated, um, was certainly in the English-speaking world. I think that would be the Church of Aphrodite, which was incorporated in New York State in 1939.
Hmm. Never heard of it.
Um,
I had to look into that now.
it's it's a fascinating story. It's a really fascinating story. Yeah, the Church of Aphrodite was founded by a Russian exile whose father had been the Tsar's doctor before the revolution.
Mm.
And he founded basically a goddess worshipping version of Orthodox Christianity.
Oh,
Um,
that sounds
and
really
it's
interesting.
really fascinating. There's a great article in the Pomegranate about it, and it was going until the 60s. At one point, the FBI sent an agent to investigate it, and he was really impressed by it and said millions of Americans would agree with this, and
Oh,
um, it's a shame perhaps that it petered out, but I think yeah, I think it was going from the 30s to the 60s
all right.
roughly.
Adding that to my list of things to go Google after this.
Huh.
And
Yeah,
speaking of
it's an
Aphrodite
interesting
and
case.
goddesses, we have a revival of Isis as well. I think that starts in England. I think.
Ah, yes, yes. And yeah, ISIS was part of the Golden Dawn
Mhm.
system of beliefs and practice. And then when Samuel Mathers, who was one of the guys behind the Golden Dawn, moved to Paris, he then continued to celebrate rites to Isis there at around the turn of the 20th century. Matt Mathers was an interesting character and a dubious character in some ways. Um, Speaking of dubious characters, you also have in Germany, you have um, right-wing nationalists and anti-Semites who are getting in on the act. Um, there's a guy called Lance von Liebenfels, for example, um, and there are sort of mystical, occult, semi-pagan nationalist German groups, one of which eventually sort of evolved into or helped to give birth to the Nazi Party after World War One. Um, you also get organized fascist pagan groups in the English-speaking world. There's a guy called Alexander Rudd Mills, who was an Australian, who founded a fascist group, I think in the 1930s,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a congregation in Melbourne of people who purported to worship Odin.
Yeah.
Um,
Why
yes,
is it this? It's something that if you can, you just go on Twitter or X these days, and you can see the right wing. Not I don't want to say right wing. I want to say ultra right wing, or just fascist, and very. Always I'm bad with the terminology. Like, I guess extreme right, the extreme right. I think that's a good term. Linking themselves with paganism and and stuff like that. Um, and I see it with Greek things. There's a particular person on X called the Hellenist. Then they're not Greek.
yeah.
I think they're from maybe Brazil or maybe somewhere in the United States. I don't know. But the things that he posts is like, oh, Hellenism will restore civilization, and like these narratives and rhetoric that they have that is very negative towards modern society, liberal, the liberal order, and wants to revert back to the past, to some sort of imagination they have, and then they tie it with their right wing ideologies. It, why is this so persistent?
Well, it goes back to Romanticism. All of this stuff goes back to Romanticism, and Romanticism had both a left wing and a right wing,
Okay.
and the left wing is represented by people like Shelley and those pagan poets, was anti-establishment, anti-authority, rebelling against Christianity, also rebelling against rationalism. Um, and it was an essentially antinomian rebel movement. You then get the form of nationalism. Sorry, you then get the form of romanticism that worships blood and soil and genealogy, and it throws out the Enlightenment and it throws out rationalism, it throws out liberalism, but it does so in order to go back to this more primitive, darker way of thinking and way of believing. Um, and that could express itself in embracing reactionary forms of Christianity. In the 19th century, I mean, in this country, for example, you had right wing romantics who embraced Catholicism. And they look back to this medieval form of
Mm,
Christianity that they felt was an antidote to the modern
yeah.
world. But there are also people in this country and elsewhere who look back to ancient paganism as an antidote to everything that they hated about the modern world.
Hmm.
Um, and there was this vision of ancient society as being authentic, harmonious, well functional. You didn't have nasty, dirty factories.
Yeah.
You didn't have science. You didn't have liberalism and the dangerous ideas or that go with it, like democracy and the free press. It was the past is always a safe place. It's a place to retreat to. And people on the right wing of Romanticism who are flying away from the modern world or fleeing the modern world.
Yeah.
In some cases, they fled to the medieval Christian era. In some cases, they fled to the pre-Christian pagan era.
Yeah, and I'm seeing this also too with Orthodox Christianity. There's a lot of reactionary I think the reactionary movement with people going to orthodoxy, the same way I think people reacted with Catholicism at some point. You know, so you're getting it. It seems like it's just pervasive everywhere at this point, and paganism just offers one particular, I guess, aesthetic or modality to express that. Now, trying to tie this all together, is this something that we could say across time with many different revivals that there is a connection between this behavior of being reactionary?
Yeah, I think that there's a common link in the Romantic movement. And if the Romantic movement is a rebellion against the Enlightenment, against modernity, against liberalism, against capitalism, you can take that in different ways. You can take that to the left and have this liberatory um, uh, way of thinking and this liberatory approach. But you can also have this deeply reactionary approach that tries to turn the clock back
Mm-hmm.
to an ancient world or a medieval world that probably never really existed.
Yeah.
And there will always be that temptation for people who are coming from this romantic perspective.
And how do we respond to that? I guess how do we deal with those sorts of things?
That's a very, very good question. Um,
Yeah.
one interesting feature of the way that the pagan revival developed in Britain, um, and this was something that happened purely by accident. It could easily have gone the other way. Um, that this was not because of some inherent virtue of the British. It was pure chance. The main pagan tradition that grew up in Britain in the 20th century was Wicca, the witchcraft religion founded by
Yeah.
Gerald Gardner. And Gerald Gardner was influenced by Margaret Murray, and Margaret Murray thought that witchcraft was this ancient pan-European, or at least pan-Western European, um, religion. It wasn't specific to Britain. There was nothing that tied it to Britain or to England. It was across different nations before Britain existed, before England existed, before France or Germany or Spain existed. Um, Murray's vision was of this religious uniformity across the continent or across the western part of the continent. And so when Gerald Gardner took up this idea, he wasn't taking up something that was specifically tied to Englishness.
Mm-hmm.
He was taking something which was international, if you like, and that crossed borders. And that meant that there was less chance of Wicca being mobilized in a fascist direction. There were some right-wing people who did get involved in Wicca. That was the case. Gardner's pupil, Doreen Valiente, was a member of the National Front for a time, the fascist political party. So there were people who were of that view, but the religion itself was not ethnically or nationally specific. And that was quite by accident, just because of the way Margaret Murray had developed her theories.
Mm-hmm.
But that obstructed, I think, the far right in Britain from getting on board with this. And to this day, you are more likely to find far rightists in Britain looking to the Christian Middle Ages, dressing up as crusaders and all
Yeah.
that sort of thing, than identifying as pagans. Although they do that as well. There's no point in denying there is a fascist element in Norse paganism here and elsewhere. But yeah, if you create a tradition that isn't tied to an ethnicity or a nation, it's less easy to turn that into something nasty.
So as we look at the past of these different revivals, how do the individuals or movements look at the Greek tradition broadly, whether it be Platonism or the ancient religious traditions, the Eleusinian mysteries, whatever it might be? How do they look at the Greek stuff and use it in their revivals?
Yeah, well, Greek philosophy, Greek literature, Greek myth is absolutely central to pagan revivalism in modern times, and indeed before modern times. And this goes back, excuse me, to the 18th century, and also to people like Shelley and Keats in the early 19th century. Um, Largely because of the huge prestige that the Greek and Roman classics had um, in European culture. Um, Someone coming from, say, Shelley's social class would have been taught this stuff at school. So it would have been second nature for someone like him to turn to this as a source of inspiration. Thomas Taylor is sort of an example of the same thing. He wasn't from the same social class as Shelley, and he didn't have the same educational advantages, but nevertheless, the resources of the Greek tradition were there for him to engage with. Um, and that continues to the present day. And there's a difficult issue here, as you know, because there comes a point where revivalists stop engaging with the Greek, or for that matter, the Roman or any other tradition, stop engaging with it, profiting from it, um, thinking about it, and reimagining it, and start lapsing into a kind of cosplay, and uh, start essentially pretending that they are Greeks. And Shelley and his circle did a bit of that. They called themselves the Athenians, for example, amongst other terms.
Hmm.
Um, there's also I'm reminded of an episode which is mentioned in the book where the poet Rupert Brooke in the early 20th century goes to a party in Germany, and it's this Bacchic themed pagan type party, and he goes dressed in ancient Greek dress, and there's this sense that and he actually says this explicitly in a letter that he writes, that he and the other people there are play acting, um, that they're acting parts in a drama. We might compare it to Star Trek cosplay, putting on a costume and pretending that you're Captain Kirk. And that of course continues to this day, and it also intersects with that issue of Hellenismos, and what is a Hellene and what is Hellenism. There is this line that can be crossed where you're no longer engaging with the tradition and learning from it, and benefiting from it, but instead you're actually pretending to be something that you're not. And at that point, um, it all becomes it all becomes a bit inauthentic and indeed offensive to people from the relevant culture.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, there was that's a lot of my work is trying to address and correct those behaviors, and I've seen, it's less frequent now, I have to say, but prior, you would see some pagans calling themselves Hellenes, and it's like, well, as a religious label, and you have to educate people. They're like, well, that's actually an ethnonym for a current existing group of people. It's not a it's not a fantasy term. Like, people don't know that. And it's like, okay, so you have to really kind of educate on the terminology and history of things. So I think, the question of how do we address everything, I guess, is education.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And there's so many resources out there, and there's a growing body of writing on this, both academic stuff and popular stuff, which of course we're trying to contribute to. And the information is there for anyone who wants it. The history is there for anyone who wants to know about it.
Yeah.
Um, Not everyone who charges onto the internet to shoot off their mouth about these things does want to know the facts, but the resources are there for those who want them.
Yes, they are there, and your new book, with Francis Young, is a great contribution to this conversation. I'm really happy it did come out. It is something that it's a topic that isn't really talked about a lot. It's new work, and it's a very important work, and I do like it. I've been reading it. It's very concise and to the point, which I like. It's very like direct. It's really well written. And so I
Well,
want to say
thank you very much.
thank you for writing this. I really I recommend it to people who want to understand that topic of persisting and revivals, and how these things never really went away, and how it's reactivated and reused over time. And I think it gives outside of the academic approach, for a practitioner, it gives them a historical sense of what are they doing today and how that might relate to history, and give a more accurate framework. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, we're still waiting for the reviews of the book to come out, and we'll have to see what people make of it. But that's very encouraging, what you say there, and yes, thank you.
Yes. So thank you again for coming on the podcast today. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much. Same to you.